Hello, everyone. My name is Suzana Đorđević, and I'm the project manager of Balkan Notes Bosnia, a project initiative that is run by Musicians Without Borders. To give you a bit of a context, Bosnia shares a border with the European Union, and it has for the past few years faced a constant influx of refugees. The country has become the last stop on the Balkans route for today's refugees fleeing wars and disasters from Middle East, Asia, and Africa. Most of the time, these refugees are faced with disheartening and discouraging conditions. Therefore, what this project does tries to offer a temporary relief to them from their daily harsh realities by sending music and art facilitators into Bosnian camps where they bring music, art, joy, and laughter to children and their families who are staying there. We are here today because I want to introduce you Eduard Nazarski, who has actually recently traveled to Bosnia and visited one of our music workshops in the refugee camp Ušivak in Sarajevo. Eduard is a former head of Amnesty International Netherlands and a co-founder of the advocacy initiative Alarm Europa. Eduard, hello.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us. Can we maybe start by you telling us something about your background and the advocacy projects that you're currently working on?
Yeah, thank you, Susanna. Well, as you said, I have been head of Amnesty International in the Netherlands. In that function, I have had, unfortunately, very many experiences with refugee policies in Europe and also with refugee situations at the borders of Europe. Before Amnesty, I was head of the Dutch Council on Refugees, where I had also some experiences, obviously, in advocacy, but also in things that refugees had to try to survive before being able to enter Europe. I am retired now, but one of the things I'm very much engaged in is a project by the Refugee Foundation in the Netherlands. Refugee Foundation that originally does emergency help in regions far outside of Europe, in the Central African Republic, be it in Bangladesh for refugees from Myanmar, or other regions from Congo, Sudan. But more and more, they have been engaged in emergency help also within Europe. And having done that for a few years, they said, well, we want to try to influence policies, because if you have an emergency situation somewhere and refugees have to immediately leave their country, that's where they get in. But within Europe, the situation is very difficult. Refugees have then already traveled a long distance, and European policies, unfortunately, are directed towards being as deterrent as possible and as sober as possible. And well, Europe doesn't want refugees to enter. That's the basic line. So the reception conditions are extremely poor, and people are in very dear situations. That's where they asked me to join their project within Europe, because, well, they felt I maybe had a bit of experience that could be helpful for them. So we have been traveling in Greece already, we have been traveling in Poland. We will go shortly to Lampedusa in Italy and also to Tunisia. And we were a few weeks ago, indeed, we were in Croatia and in Bosnia. I've seen some situations now in Bosnia which still make me shiver.
Eduard, can you maybe give us a short context or your view of the current refugee situation?
Yeah, well, the refugee situation in general, I've seen now 35 years of development towards being more and more restrictive, more and more deterrent, and even more and more hostile to refugees all over Europe. I can see that. I see that European governments are really struggling to get a grip on the number of refugees that is trying to enter the country. They have been designing asylum procedures, and they have been looking at ways of speeding up things. What they didn't do is to look at real solutions for refugees, be it in their own country, be it abroad. I've seen from 1990 that policy makers, ministers, leaders of state, that I said, we have a problem with too many people that are coming. So we need to be more tough. We need to be more restrictive. We need to be more deterrent. And I've seen over the years that developing into becoming more hostile, and we need to keep them out. Which is now what is happening in Italy, and what Croatia is doing now recently. More deterrent without thinking of real solutions for refugees, people that have to flee their country because they're not safe anymore, which leads to an enormous amount of misery across the borders of Europe. And I've seen that in Poland, I've seen that in Greece, and also in Bosnia and Sarajevo and Bihać, where Europe could be smarter and could be better. So that is unfortunately the situation, where I also see desperate people and strong people wanting to have a better life for themselves or for their children, and that people are aware of all kinds of dangers that are upon them, that have already survived many dangers if they cross the Mediterranean and cross parts of Turkey, of North Africa, partly desperate of the situation they're in, but also extremely resilient in trying to come to a safe place where they finally can start rebuilding their lives. And that is something that puzzles me, how it is possible that an affluent and safe and stable continent like Europe is so extremely rude and rough against refugees.
In March, as you mentioned, you have, together with the Netherlands Refugee Foundation delegation, made a trip to Bosnia. The aim of that trip was to bring attention to the poor situation in which many refugees and migrants find themselves. Can you maybe share some of your experiences and what you have seen in Bosnia?
Yeah, well, if you allow me, I'll start very briefly. We started in Zagreb, where we met some organizations who gave us an overview of what's happening in Croatia, where border police, etc., had the reputation of being extremely forceful and using violence in order to push asylum seekers, migrants, refugees back across the borders to Bosnia. And in Bihać, unfortunately, we didn't see migrants, refugees, but we were visiting with some organizations, some squads where people try to survive. And I must say that was a very depressing experience. Former factories empty, no electricity, no water, and then some mattresses on the floor where you could see that people have been sleeping, and imagining that I would have to be there as a refugee with possibly my children or my wife, and then saying, well, we'll have to stay here for the night, and I'll be sure that you are safe and just go to sleep, and I'll be watching you and be watching others, that you will not be harmed. Really, really terrible to see. And then hearing stories of very strong activists and volunteers on how they try to assist those persons, those individuals, those families, those groups, with food, with advice, sometimes with blankets, but also with possibilities to cross the border, because it's only natural to try to assist, because we know what it is. Europe apparently isn't capable of developing and designing a smarter refugee policy that really leads to some solutions, instead of just, letting people wait before the borders, and then if they try to cross, just to push them back or to hit them back. And I saw some really terrible examples of people that were wounded in their head or that had broken ribs, and they said, well, that's because of and that smashed the telephones, etc. In the week that we are there, it was just a bit quiet by the Croatian police, but 2 weeks later we heard that they had restarted this return or the deportation policy again, and also using violence in that. Then we drove by car to Sarajevo, which is 4 or 5 hours drive. And when we got into the camp, it was very easy to get there, because we said, well, we are visitors of Musicians Without Borders and we have an appointment. Oh, of course, well, just continue. And then we parked the car and we were just trying to discover where the workshop was, because we didn't know exactly. And then we saw some people walking, so we just followed the crowd a bit. But we had heard from volunteers and activists in Bihać really terrible stories, and we had seen those squats. And then you open a door in quite a large room, and you see maybe 25, 30 people. You hear some music, some singing, some rhythm instruments, some percussion, hear some guitars, and you see then 30 people that are enjoying themselves and that are laughing and that are a bit dancing, and you see very enthusiastic workshop leaders. And there was really the gap between what we had heard and what we had seen and experienced, and then seeing this workshop. It really was a wonderful experience.
Can you maybe share a highlight from this workshop, or go a little bit more into details of what you think, how this type of workshop activities have effect on refugees staying in the camp?
It is extremely important for people to to be a bit distracted of their situation. And of course, distracted means that afterwards you have to be focused again on other things, but to have some entertainment, a bit of enjoyable moments. There were a very good workshop leader who also played guitar, who was very enthusiastic and also very tired after the workshop. I saw they share percussion instruments, they share things to play on. One young man ran to his room and came back with a couple of bongas. In my free time, I'm an amateur musician, and I know that sometimes it's very difficult to play with people that don't feel the rhythm. And people could be very enthusiastic and applauding, but they did that in a very smart and smooth way, so everybody could join. And then they also asked people to stand up, to sit down, to dance, to make a step forward, to make a step back, and to make some moves. Well, they had a lot of differences too in approach and rhythms and melodies. And for me, it was also very nice to see how a saxophone player joined the workshop leaders. And, then you have a bit more of a melody, which was also very nice. And he played very well, alto saxophone. For some time, we saw how people were laughing. We saw how people were enjoying the music. We saw how they were laughing sometimes when things went wrong, because obviously when you are improvising, things can go wrong. Maybe things should go wrong sometimes, but it was nice to see, and people being enthusiastic. And my general feeling was that if you are on the run and you are in such a camp on the very near Sarajevo, and you want not to stay in Bosnia, because almost nobody wants to stay in Bosnia. 98% UNHCR told us wants to travel to Europe, because there's more perspective in Western European countries. And you know how difficult it is, and you must sometimes feel extremely desperate and being doubtful on, was it wise to come here, and should we have taken another route, should we have done different? How do we get enough money to do this? How do we get enough money to do that? Could we see a doctor on because one of the children is suffering from something, or all that kind of, and then suddenly you have an hour of really enjoying yourself. That is wonderful. That is really important. The moment, you could feel that the tension in people went away when they were inside, and that they were surprising themselves in laughing and participating.
Thank you, Edward, for sharing this experience. Me, as a project manager of Welcome Notes Bosnia, I'm very happy that you got to visit one of our workshops, and that you enjoyed it, and that you also saw the effect that our music facilitators are able to bring into camps and safe houses across Bosnia.
What you do in those workshops is a message of hope to people, of joy and of hope. I think that is extremely important, and I feel the resilience of persons I met in those very dear circumstances, but also the resilience of activists and volunteers and workshop leaders in keep on doing what they can do to contribute to make it that people, at least for a moment, have a feeling, a normal life, on some human dignity, maybe on decency, on other people that care for you a bit. But I hope that we will be strong enough to convince politicians that things should be dealt with differently.